This is a story about a boy who had nothing, but somehow found everything through music. He grew up in a small forgotten town where factories had closed down years ago, and most families struggled just to pay rent every month. The streets were gray, and the buildings looked tired, like they had given up hoping for better days. In one of those old apartment blocks lived a 12-year-old boy with his mother. They had a tiny 2-room place on the 4th floor where the elevator never worked, and the walls were so thin you could hear neighbors arguing at night. His mother worked at a local diner from early morning until late evening. Sometimes she would pick up extra shifts on weekends just to make sure there was food on the table, and the electricity stayed on. The boy rarely saw her during the week. She would leave before he woke up for school and come home after he had already fallen asleep, but every night she would quietly open his bedroom door and watch him sleep for a few minutes. She would whisper that she loved him and promised that one day things would get better. The boy always pretended to be asleep, but he heard every word. Those whispered promises kept him going through the hardest days. Life was not easy for him at school. Either other kids had new clothes and fancy gadgets, while he wore the same 3 shirts on rotation. They had parents who dropped them off in nice cars, while he walked 40 minutes each way. No matter the weather, some kids made fun of him for being poor. They laughed at his worn-out shoes and his packed lunches. There were always the same cheap sandwiches. He learned to stay quiet and invisible. He sat in the back of every classroom and never raised his hand, even when he knew the answers. Teachers barely noticed him, and classmates forgot he existed. That was fine with him. Being invisible meant being safe from their cruel words. One autumn afternoon, everything changed. The boy was walking home from school, taking his usual route through the old part of town. He passed by a thrift store that he had seen 100 times before, but never entered. That day, something in the window caught his eye. It was a violin, old and dusty, with scratches on its wooden body and strings that looked like they might snap any moment. Most people would have walked right past it without a second glance, but the boy stopped. He stood there on the sidewalk, staring at that broken instrument like it was calling out to him. Had never played music before. His school did not have a music program, and lessons cost money. His family simply did not have yet. Something about that violin spoke to him in a way he could not explain. He walked into the store and asked the old woman behind the counter how much it cost. She looked at the violin and then looked at the boy in his faded jacket. $5, she said. Boy reached into his pocket and pulled out exactly $5.32. It was his lunch money for the whole week. He handed her the $5 without hesitation. The woman wrapped the violin in old newspaper and gave it to him with a small smile. She told him it probably did not work anymore, but he did not care. He carried it home like it was made of gold. That night he sat on his bed and held the violin for hours. He did not know how to play a single note. He did not even know how to hold it properly, but when he ran his fingers over the worn wood, he felt something stir inside his chest. It felt like hope. It felt like maybe there was something in this world that could be just his. Over the next few days, he started teaching himself. He found an old tablet that his mother had bought secondhand years ago. The screen was cracked and it ran slowly, but it connected to the internet at the local library. Every day after school, he would go to the library and watch videos of people playing violin. He studied their hand positions and their posture and the way they moved the bow across the strings. Then he would rush home and practice in the basement of his apartment building. The basement was cold and dark and smelled like dust and old pipes, but it was the only place where no one could hear him. He did not want anyone to know about the violin. It was his secret, his one precious thing that belonged only to him. The first few weeks were terrible. The sounds that came out of that old violin were painful to hear, screeching and squeaking like an animal in distress. His fingers hurt and his arm ached, and sometimes he wanted to give up, but every time he felt like quitting, he remembered his mother coming home exhausted with swollen feet. He remembered her whispered promises in the dark. If she could keep going, then so could he. Slowly things started to change. The terrible sounds became less terrible. His fingers learned where to go, and his bow arm found its rhythm. He practiced every single day without exception. Even when he was sick, even when he was tired, even when his fingers bled and he had to wrap them in bandages. One evening, the building janitor found him in the basement. The boy froze, expecting to be yelled at or kicked out, but the old janitor just stood there listening. When the boy finished playing, the janitor nodded slowly. He told the boy that he used to play violin too many years ago. Before life took him in different directions. From that day on, the janitor became his teacher, not a formal teacher with lesson plans and certificates, just an old man sharing what he remembered with a young boy hungry to learn. They met in the basement 3 times a week. The janitor showed him techniques that no video could teach. He taught him that music was not about hitting the right notes. It was about feeling something deep inside and letting it flow through your fingers. He said that the best musicians do not play with their hands. They play with their hearts. The boy listened and practiced and grew better every single month. 2 years passed this way. 2 years of secret lessons in a dusty basement. 2 years of practicing until midnight and waking up early for school. 2 years of carrying this hidden world inside him while the outside world saw nothing but a quiet, poor kid. Then, one spring morning, he saw a flyer posted on the community center bulletin board. The Hartwell Youth Orchestra was holding open auditions. This was not just any orchestra. It was the most prestigious youth music program in the entire region. Kids from wealthy families trained for years. Hoping to get in, they had expensive instruments and private tutors and parents who could afford the best of everything. The auditions were always held in fancy concert halls in rich neighborhoods. But this year, for the first time ever, they were coming to the community center in his town. The flyer said they wanted to find hidden talent in overlooked places. It said everyone was welcome to try out regardless of background or training. The boy read that flyer over again. His heart was pounding so hard, he could feel it in his throat. Part of him wanted to run away and forget he ever saw it. Who was he to audition for something like this? He had no formal training. His violin was held together with tape and prayer. The other kids would have instruments worth thousands of dollars. They would have years of professional lessons and performance experience. He would be laughed out of the room. But another part of him remembered those nights in the basement hall. Those hours of practice, all that pain and sacrifice. The janitor once told him that talent does not care about money or status. He said that music finds its way into the hearts that need it most. Boy stood in front of that bulletin board for a long time. People walked past him without noticing. Finally, he picked up the pen hanging from a string next to this sign-up sheet. His hand was trembling so badly he could barely write, but he wrote his name anyway. One small name on a long list of hopeful kids. He had no idea that this simple act would change his entire life forever. He walked home that afternoon feeling terrified and excited at the same time. The audition was in 3 weeks. He had 21 days to prepare for the most important moment of his young life. 21 days to prove that a poor boy with a broken violin and a heart full of dreams could stand alongside the privileged few. He did not know what would happen. He only knew that he had to try, because sometimes the only way out of the darkness is to make your own light. The moment he signed his name on that audition sheet, everything became real. Suddenly, those 21 days felt like 21 hours. Time was slipping through his fingers like water, and there was so much he needed to do that evening. He rushed to the basement faster than ever before. The janitor was already there, sweeping the floor like he did every night. When the boy told him about the audition, the old man stopped sweeping and looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his eyes that the boy had never seen before. It looked like pride mixed with worry, mixed with something deeper that words could not capture. The janitor sat down on an old wooden crate and rubbed his weathered hands. Together, he told the boy that this audition would not be like anything he had ever experienced. the people judging, would be professionals who had spent their whole lives in music. They would not care about his story or his struggles or how hard he had worked. They would only care about what they heard when he played. That was the brutal truth of the music world. Either you were good enough or you were not. No excuses and no second chances. The boy felt his stomach tighten, but he nodded. Understood what the janitor was telling him. This was not a feel-good competition where everyone got a ribbon for trying. This was the real thing. The janitor stood up and walked over to a dusty corner of the basement, moved some old boxes aside, and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, the boy gasped. It was a violin, not a fancy new one, but a beautiful old instrument that glowed with a deep amber color. The janitor explained that this violin had been with him for 40 years. He had played it in concert halls across the country back when he was young and full of dreams. Life had taken those dreams away, but he had kept the violin hidden all these years. He could not bear to sell it or give it away. Now he wanted the boy to use it for the audition. The boy shook his head immediately, could not take something so precious, but the janitor pressed it into his hands, said that an instrument is meant to be played, not hidden in the dark. He said that this violin had been waiting for someone worthy to bring it back to life. The boy held it like it was made of glass. When he drew the bow across the strings, the sound that came out made his heart stop. It was rich and warm and full of depths he had never heard before. Compared to his old thrift store violin, this was like comparing a whisper to a symphony. That night, they began preparing in earnest. The janitor asked him what piece he planned to play for the audition. The boy had been thinking about this for hours. He wanted something that would show everything he could do, something technical enough to impress, but emotional enough to move people. The janitor suggested a piece that made the boy nervous just hearing the name. It was called Chardas by a composer named Monty. This was one of the most demanding violin pieces ever written. Professional musicians feared it because one small mistake could ruin everything. It required speed and precision and passion all at once. The boy had watched videos of masters playing it, and they made it look impossible, but the janitor believed he could do it. Said that the piece was perfect because it told a story of struggle and triumph. It started slow and mournful, like someone carrying heavy pain, then it exploded into wild, fierce energy, like a spirit breaking free. It was exactly what the boy needed to show the judges. Not just technical skill, but a soul fighting to be heard. They practiced every single night for the next 3 weeks. The janitor pushed him harder than ever. Before, every note had to be perfect. Every transition had to be smooth. Every emotion had to be genuine. When the boy made mistakes, the janitor made him repeat sections dozens of times. When he got frustrated, the janitor reminded him what was at stake. When he wanted to give up, the janitor told him stories about his own journey. He talked about performing in front of thousands of people and feeling like his heart might burst. He talked about the sacrifices he made and the relationships he lost chasing his dream. He talked about the accident that damaged his hand and ended his career overnight. The boy listened to these stories and felt a new kind of respect for the old man. Here was someone who had reached the highest peaks and fallen to the lowest valleys, yet he still loved music enough to spend his nights teaching a poor kid in the basement. That kind of love was something sacred. At home, things started to change too. His mother noticed that he was different. Somehow he seemed more focused and more determined. He spent less time staring at walls and more time rushing off somewhere after school. She asked him what was going on, but he just smiled and said everything was fine. He was not ready to tell her about the violin or the audition part of him. Was scared that if he said it out loud, it would jinx everything. Another part was scared of disappointing her if he failed. Better to keep it secret until he knew the outcome. But she could sense something shifting in her son. There was a light in his eyes that had not been there before. She did not push him to explain. She just hugged him a little tighter before leaving for work. Each morning, the days flew by in a blur of practice in school and sleepless nights. The boy would dream about the audition and wake up in a cold sweat. He imagined walking into a room full of rich kids staring at him with contempt. Imagined the judges dismissing him before he even played a note. He imagined his fingers freezing up and forgetting everything. He learned these nightmares haunted him, but they also fueled him. Every fear became a reason to practice harder. Every doubt became a challenge to overcome. 1 week before the audition, the janitor made him perform the entire piece without stopping. The boy played it from beginning to end while the old man sat in silence. When it was over, the janitor did not say anything for a long time. Boy felt panic rising in his chest. Was it not good enough? Had all this preparation been for nothing? Then the janitor looked up at him with tears in his eyes. He said that in 40 years of playing and teaching he had never heard anyone play with such raw honesty. Said the boy had something that could not be taught, something that came from deep inside, where pain and hope lived together. He said that when the boy played, it was like watching someone turn their entire life into sound. That night, the boy walked home feeling like he was floating. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe he had a chance. Maybe all those years of secret practice had actually led somewhere. Maybe his story was not meant to end in poverty and invisibility. 3 days before the audition, his old violin finally gave up. One of the strings snapped during practice, and when he tried to replace it, the neck cracked. He held the broken instrument in his hands and felt tears streaming down his face. This violin had been his companion for over 2 years. It had taught him everything and asked for nothing. In return, the janitor found him crying in the basement, surrounded by pieces of wood and broken strings. He did not say anything, just sat down next to the boy and put a hand on his shoulder. After a while, he reminded the boy that instruments break, but music lives forever. Everything that old violin taught him was now inside his heart, where nothing could destroy it. The night before the audition, the boy could not sleep at all. He lay in bed, holding the janitor violin close to his chest. He thought about his mother working double shifts so he could have food and shelter. He thought about the janitor sharing his most precious possession with a kid he barely knew. He thought about all the people who had laughed at him and looked down on him. He thought about what it would mean to prove them all wrong tomorrow. He would walk into that audition room carrying the weight of his entire life. Tomorrow, he would either take one step closer to his dreams or watch them crumble. Tomorrow, everything he had worked for would be tested in front of strangers who held his future in their hands. As the first light of dawn crept through his window, he made himself a promise. No matter what happened, he would play like it was the last time he would ever hold a violin. He would pour everything he had into those few minutes on stage. He would not hold back a single drop of emotion, because if this was his only shot, he was going to make it count. He got dressed in the nicest clothes he owned, which was just a plain white shirt and dark pants. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror and took a deep breath. The boy staring back at him looked scared and small, but somewhere behind those frightened eyes, there was fire. Today was the day everything would change. He just did not know yet whether it would change for better or worse. The community center looked different that morning. He had passed by this building 1,000 times without giving it much thought, but today it felt like a fortress standing between him and everything he ever wanted. There were cars parked all along the street, not the old rusty vehicles he was used to seeing in his neighborhood. These were expensive, shiny cars that cost more than his mother made in 5 years. Parents in elegant clothes stepped out holding instrument cases that gleamed in the morning sun. Their children walked beside them with perfect posture and confident smiles. These kids looked like they had been preparing for this moment their entire lives, because they probably had the boy stood across the street watching them file into the building one by one. His heart was beating so fast he could feel it in his ears. Violin case in his hands suddenly felt heavy, like it was filled with stones instead of wood and strings. He thought about turning around and going Oh, nobody would know, nobody would care. He could pretend he never saw that flyer and go back to his invisible life. But then he remembered the janitor staying late every night to teach. He remembered his mother whispering promises in the dark. He remembered all those hours in the basement when his fingers bled and his arms screamed for rest. If he walked away now, all of that would mean nothing. He took a deep breath and crossed the street. The moment he stepped inside the community center, he felt like he had entered another world. The main hall had been transformed into a waiting area with rows of chairs and registration tables. Parents chatted with each other about their children's accomplishments like they were comparing trophies. One mother mentioned that her daughter had been playing since age 4 and had already won 3 regional competitions. Another father bragged that his son had private lessons with a teacher who once played for the National Symphony. The boy walked past them with his head down, trying not to be noticed, but people noticed anyway. Few parents glanced at his worn clothes and looked away quickly. Some kids whispered to each other and giggled. He found the registration table and gave his name to the woman sitting there. She scanned her list and checked them off without looking up. Then she handed him a number 47. He was candidate number 47 out of more than 60 kids. That meant he would have to wait for hours, watching everyone else perform before his turn came. He found an empty seat in the corner of the room and sat down, clutching his violin case. The chair next to him was taken by a boy around his age, dressed in a crisp suit that probably cost more than everything in his closet combined. The rich boy looked at him and then looked at his violin case. He asked what kind of violin he had. The poor boy hesitated before saying it was an old one. The rich boy laughed and said old violins were either priceless antiques or worthless junk. He asked which category his fell into. The poor boy did not answer. He just looked down at his feet and wished he could disappear. The rich boy shrugged and turned away to talk to his friends. They all seemed to know each other from music camps and competitions. They spoke a language of teachers and techniques that the poor boy did not understand. He had never been to a music camp, had never competed in anything, had learned everything in a dusty basement from an old janitor. Compared to these kids, he was nobody. Auditions began, and one by one candidates were called into the performance hall. Each time the doors opened, he could catch a glimpse inside. There was a stage with bright lights and a long table where 3 judges sat watching. The main judge was a woman with silver hair pulled back tight. Even from a distance, she looked intimidating. Her face showed no emotion as she listened to each performance. The boy had heard stories about her. She was the director of the Hartwell Youth Orchestra and one of the most respected figures in classical music. People said she had impossibly high standards and had rejected hundreds of talented kids over the years. They said she could spot weakness in a performance before the first note ended. They said she had never once smiled during an audition. As the hours passed, he watched candidate after candidate walk through those doors. Some came out looking relieved. Others came out with tears in their eyes. The rich boy in the suit went in and came out 20 minutes later with a smug grin. His friends gathered around him asking how it went. He said the judges seemed impressed, especially by his technical precision. Said he played a complicated piece flawlessly, and the director even nodded at the end. The poor boy felt his confidence shrinking with every passing minute. These kids were trained professionals. They had spent years perfecting their craft under the guidance of expert teachers. What was he thinking coming here? He was just a poor kid who taught himself in a basement. Janitor was kind, but he was not a real teacher. That old violin was beautiful, but it could not make up for his lack of experience. Maybe this whole thing was a mistake. Maybe he should just leave before embarrassing himself in front of everyone. He was about to stand up when a voice called his number 47. His legs felt like they were made of water as he walked toward the doors. The raises. Other kids watched him pass by with curious expressions. A few of them smirked when they saw his cheap clothes and nervous Face one girl whispered something to her friend, and they both laughed quietly. He pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into the performance hall. The room was bigger than he expected. Rows of empty seats stretched out before the stage like an ocean of red velvet. At the far end sat the three judges behind their long table. The director was in the middle writing something on a notepad. She did not look up when he entered. The other two judges glanced at him briefly, then returned to their papers. He walked to the center of the stage, feeling smaller with every step. The bright lights above made him squint, and sweat began forming on his forehead. He announced his name and his number in a voice that came out weaker than he wanted. Director still did not look up. She asked what piece he would be performing in a flat, uninterested tone. When he said Chardas by Monty, she finally raised her eyes. There was surprise in her expression, followed quickly by skepticism. One of the other judges actually chuckled under his breath. The director studied him for a long moment, taking in his second-hand clothes and nervous posture. She asked where he had trained. He told her he was mostly self-taught. Her eyebrows rose slightly, and she exchanged a look with the judge beside her. Could read her thoughts as clearly as if she had spoken them out loud. She was wondering why a self-taught kid with no formal training would dare attempt one of the most difficult violin pieces ever written. She probably thought he was either arrogant or foolish, or both. She looked back down at her notepad and waved her hand dismissively. Gesture told him everything. She had already made up her mind. In her eyes, he was just another unqualified candidate, wasting her valuable time. She expected him to fail, and she was already thinking about the next audition. The boy felt a flash of something hot in his chest. It was not anger exactly. It was something deeper and more powerful. It was the feeling of being dismissed before being given a chance. The feeling of being judged by appearance instead of ability. The feeling he had carried his entire life. As a poor kid in a world that only valued wealth, he thought about his mother coming home exhausted night after night. He thought about the janitor believing in him when no one else did. He thought about every person who had ever looked at him like he was nothing. He lifted the violin to his shoulder and positioned the bow above the strings. His hands were trembling, but he forced them to steady. The judges were not even paying attention. The director was writing notes, and the others were shuffling papers. They had already dismissed him in their minds, but they had no idea what was about to happen. They had no idea that this poor boy with the warm clothes carried inside him years of pain and hope and desperate hunger. They had no idea that every struggle in his life had been transformed into music waiting to break free. He closed his eyes and took one final breath. Room was silent, except for the soft rustling of papers. Then he began to play, and in that instant, everything changed. The first note that left his violin was unlike anything that Room had ever heard. It cut through the air like a beam of light breaking through storm clouds. The director stopped writing mid-sentence. Her pen froze above the paper, as if time itself had paused. The other two judges lifted their heads with expressions of pure disbelief. This was not what they expected. This was not what anyone expected. Boy played the opening passage of Chardas with a tenderness that made the walls seem to lean in closer. Each note hung in the air like a whispered secret before dissolving into the next. His eyes were closed and his body swayed gently with the melody. He was not performing for the judges anymore. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere deep inside himself, where music and memory blended together. The slow, mournful beginning of the piece poured out of him like tears that had been held back for years. Every struggle he had ever faced found its voice in those notes. The empty apartment waiting for a mother who worked too hard. The cruel laughter of classmates who saw only his poverty. The hunger pangs he hid so his mother would not worry. Loneliness of being invisible in a world that only noticed people with money. All of it flowed through his fingers and into the strings outside. In the waiting area, something strange began to happen. The parents who had been chatting loudly fell silent one by one. Kids who had been comparing notes stopped mid-conversation. Everyone turned toward the closed doors of the performance hall. Even through those heavy wooden barriers, the music reached them. It was faint but unmistakable. Someone in that room was playing something extraordinary. Rich boy in the expensive suit stood up from his chair with a puzzled look. He walked closer to the doors, straining to hear better. Other candidates followed until a small crowd had gathered. They pressed their ears against the wood, trying to catch every note inside the hall. The boy transitioned into the faster section of the piece. His bow flew across the strings with a speed that seemed impossible. The notes cascaded like a waterfall, tumbling over rocks. Yet, every single one was clear and precise and perfectly placed. This was the part that made professional musicians tremble, the part where one tiny mistake could unravel everything. But the boy did not make mistakes. His fingers danced across the fingerboard as if they had been born, knowing exactly where to go. The director leaned forward in her seat. Her face had transformed from boredom to something approaching wondering. 30 years of judging auditions, she had never seen anything like this. She had listened to thousands of young musicians from the finest conservatories in the world. She had heard technical perfection countless times, but this was different. This boy was not just playing the notes, he was living them. He was bleeding them. Every phrase told a story of survival and defiance. The second judge removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. He was embarrassed to feel tears forming, but he could not help it. Something about this performance reached into his chest and grabbed his heart. The third judge had stopped taking notes entirely. She sat with her mouth slightly open, forgetting to breathe. The boy launched into the most demanding passage of the entire piece. His bow moved so fast it became a blur of motion. The notes spiraled higher and higher, building toward an impossible crescendo. Sweat dripped down his forehead, but he did not notice. His white shirt clung to his back, but he did not care. He was no longer a poor kid auditioning for an orchestra. He was a force of nature unleashing years of silent suffering. Every night in that cold basement had prepared him for this moment. Every bleeding finger and aching arm had led to this stage. Every whispered promise from his mother echoed in every note. Janitor had told him that music was not about perfection, it was about truth. And right now he was telling the truest story he had ever told. Back in the waiting area, the crowd by the doors had grown larger. Parents and children stood shoulder to shoulder, straining to hear. The woman who had bragged about her daughter winning 3 competitions had tears streaming down her face. She did not even know who was playing, but the music reached something deep inside her. The father who had boasted about his son's expensive teacher stood in stunned silence. He had spent a fortune on lessons and equipment and summer programs, yet he had never heard his son play with even a fraction of this emotion. The rich boy who had mocked the poor boy violin pressed his palm flat against the door. His smug expression had vanished completely. In its place was something that looked almost like shame. He realized now that all his training and all his expensive gear meant nothing compared to what he was hearing. Some things could not be bought. Some things could only be earned through struggle. Inside the hall, the boy reached the final section of Chardas. The melody shifted into a wild, passionate dance. It was the sound of someone refusing to be defeated. The sound of a spirit that had been pushed down again and again, but always found the strength to rise. His whole body moved with the music now. He was not playing the violin anymore. The violin was playing him. They had become one instrument, channeling something greater than either could produce alone. The director rose slowly from her seat. She had never stood during an audition before. It simply was not done. But her legs moved on their own as if pulled upward by invisible strings. The other judges watched her with wide eyes. They had worked with her for years and never seen her react this way. The boy did not notice any of this. His eyes were still closed. He was lost in a world where only the music existed. Final notes approached, and he poured every last drop of energy into them. His bow arm burned with exhaustion, but he pushed through. His fingers screamed for rest, but he refused to slow down. This was everything. This was his entire life compressed into a few minutes of sound. The last note rang out high and clear and impossibly pure. It hung in the air for what felt like forever. Then slowly it faded into silence. The boy lowered his violin and opened his eyes. He was breathing hard and trembling from the effort. For a moment he did not know where he was. The bright lights blinded him, and his ears rang from the intensity of his own playing. Then the silence hit him, complete and total silence. No applause, no reaction, nothing. His heart sank into his stomach. He had failed. He must have made mistakes. He did not notice. The judges hated it, wanted to run off stage and never look back. But then he looked at the judges' table. The second judge was crying openly, not even trying to hide it. Third judge had her hand pressed over her heart, as if checking that it was still beating, and the director was standing in front of her chair with tears rolling down her cheeks. In 30 years she had never cried during an audition. She had built a reputation on being cold and impossible to impress. But now she stood there weeping like a child hearing a lullaby. She began walking toward the stage. Her heels clicked against the floor in the silent room. Boy watched her approach, not understanding what was happening. Was she coming to tell him to leave? Was she going to criticize his technique? She climbed the 3 steps to the stage and stopped directly in front of him. For a long moment, she just looked at him, really looked at him, not at his cheap clothes or his nervous posture. She looked into his eyes and saw something that made her cry even harder. Then she did something that no one in that room could have predicted. She reached out and placed her hand gently on his cheek. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. She asked him where he had been hiding all this time. She said she had spent her whole career searching for what he just showed her. She said that in 30 years of listening to young musicians, she had never heard anyone play with such devastating honesty. Boy did not know what to say. He stood there trembling as tears began falling from his own eyes. Through the doors, the crowd in the waiting area could hear nothing, but somehow they knew something extraordinary had just happened. Silence that followed his performance was louder than any applause could ever bait. Was the silence of people who had just witnessed something that changed them. The silence of hearts being cracked open and put back together differently. The silence of a world being forced to recognize what it had overlooked. And somewhere in the back of the room, hidden in the shadows, an old janitor stood watching. He had snuck in through a side entrance just to see his student perform. His weathered hands were clasped together and tears streamed down his wrinkled face. He whispered words that no one else could hear. He said that he always knew this boy was special, and now finally the whole world would know it too. News spread through the community center like wildfire. Within minutes, everyone knew that something incredible had happened inside that performance hall. Parents whispered to each other, asking who the boy was and where he came from. The candidates who had mocked him earlier now stood in confused silence. When the doors finally opened, the boy walked out in a daze. His legs felt weak, and his mind could not process what had just occurred. The director followed close behind him with red eyes and a strange smile on her face. She asked him to wait while she spoke with the other judges. He found a quiet corner and sat down, trying to steady his breathing. The rich boy in the expensive suit approached him slowly. His arrogant expression was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like respect. Stood there for a moment, not knowing what to say. Then he simply nodded at the poor boy and walked away. No apology was spoken, but that nod said everything. It was an acknowledgement from one musician to another, a silent admission that talent cannot be measured by clothing or money. 30 minutes passed before the director came to find him. She sat down beside him and spoke in a voice much softer than before. She told him that in her entire career she had never offered anyone what she was about to offer him. She said the Hartwell Youth Orchestra wanted him not just as a member, but as their youngest featured soloist. She explained that a full scholarship to the Hartwell Conservatory would be provided. All his training and education would be covered completely. She reached into her bag and pulled out a long velvet case. When she opened it, the boy stopped breathing. Inside was a violin that seemed to glow with an inner light. She told him this instrument was handcrafted by one of the greatest makers in the world. It was worth more money than he could imagine. She wanted him to have it as a gift. The boy shook his head and tried to refuse. He could not accept something so valuable, but she pressed the case into his hands. She said that extraordinary talent deserves extraordinary tools. She said this violin had been waiting for the right person, and now it had found him. Held the case against his chest and felt tears building again. This morning he had woken up as a nobody now. He was holding an instrument worth a fortune and had a future brighter than any dream. The director gave him her card and told him to call her office on Monday. There were papers to sign and arrangements to make. She squeezed his shoulder before walking away to address the other candidates. He sat there alone, trying to understand how his life had changed in a single afternoon. The janitor appeared beside him, quiet as always. He must have slipped in through that side entrance and stayed hidden until now. The old man looked at the velvet case and smiled, asked if he could see the new violin. The boy opened the case, and the janitor ran his fingers gently over the polished wood. He said it was the most beautiful instrument he had ever seen. Then he looked at the boy with eyes full of pride. He said that this was just the beginning. Said the world was about to discover what he had known all along. The boy threw his arms around the old man and hugged him tight. He thanked him for everything, for the lessons and the patience and the belief, for sharing his own precious violin. When the boy had nothing, the janitor hugged him back and whispered that he was proud. Those two words meant more than any scholarship or fancy instrument ever could. That evening, the boy walked home, carrying both violin cases, one old and borrowed and one new and gifted. His mind raced with thoughts of how to tell his mother. He had kept this secret for so long, and now everything was about to come out. When he reached his apartment building, he saw her sitting on the front steps. She was still in her work uniform, looking exhausted from another long shift. But when she saw him, her face lit up with the same tired smile she always gave him. Then she noticed the two cases in his hands. Her smile faded into confusion. She asked what he was carrying. He sat down beside her and took a deep breath. Then he told her everything. He told her about finding the violin at the thrift store 2 years ago. He told her about teaching himself in the basement night after night. He told her about the janitor who became his secret teacher. He told her about the audition and the performance and the scholarship. She listened without saying a word. Her eyes grew wider with each new piece of information. When he finished, he sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Then she began to cry, not sad tears, but tears of overwhelming emotion. She pulled him into her arms and held him so tight he could barely breathe. She kept saying she had no idea. She kept apologizing for working so much and missing so much of his life. He told her she had nothing to apologize for. Everything she did was for him. Every double shift and every sacrifice had given him the chance to pursue this dream. Hard work had kept a roof over his head and food in his stomach. Without her, he would have had nothing. They sat on those steps crying together until the sun went down. For the first time in years, they talked about everything. About his father who left when he was a baby, about the struggle she faced raising him alone, about the dreams she had given up so he could have a chance. He promised her that from now on things would be different. Told her that the scholarship included a monthly allowance. She would never have to work double shifts again. She shook her head and said she did not care about money. She only cared that her son had found something that made him happy. 3 months later, the boy stood backstage at the Hartwell Concert Hall. This was the venue where the greatest musicians in the country had performed tonight. It would host a special concert to introduce him to the world. The Program called him a young prodigy discovered through the open audition program. Newspapers had picked up his story, and people were fascinated. A poor self-taught boy who would silence the toughest critics with nothing but raw talent. The auditorium was packed with over 2,000 people. Music lovers and journalists and curious strangers filled every seat, but the boy only cared about one person in that audience. His mother sat in the front row wearing a new dress he had bought her. She had rushed straight from work and barely had time to change her. Hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes glistened with nervous anticipation. Beside her sat the old janitor in a suit he had borrowed from somewhere. He looked uncomfortable in the formal clothes, but his face beamed with pride. The stage manager gave the signal, and the boy walked out into the spotlight. Applause filled the hall like rolling thunder. He bowed politely and waited for silence. Then he raised the microphone and did something that was not in the program. He dedicated this performance to two people. First, to his mother, who had sacrificed everything so he could survive, and second, to an old janitor who saw a diamond when everyone else saw dirt. The audience murmured with curiosity. They did not know the full story yet, but they would understand soon enough. He lifted the violin to his shoulder, the same piece he had played at the audition Charades by Monty. The opening notes floated into the hall, soft and haunting. 2,000 people fell completely silent. His mother pressed her hand over her mouth as tears began streaming down. This was the first time she had ever heard him play. All those years of secret practice, and she had never known. She understood why he had seemed different lately, why there had been a new light in his eyes. He had been carrying this beautiful gift inside him all along. The music swelled and grew, filling every corner of the massive hall. The boy played with even more passion than he had at the audition, because now his mother was watching. Now, the person he loved most in the world could finally see who he really was. The fast sections made the audience gasp. The emotional passages made them weep. By the time he reached the final notes, people were already rising from their seats. The last sound faded into silence. Then, the hall exploded with applause. 2,000 people stood and cheered, and some even shouted. The boy lowered his violin and looked at the front row. His mother was standing with both hands covering her face, sobbing uncontrollably. The janitor beside her clapped so hard, his borrowed suit threatened to split at the seams. Boy smiled through his own tears. This moment was not about fame or success or proving anyone wrong. It was about a mother who never stopped believing, even when she did not know what to believe in. It was about an old man who shared his last treasure with a stranger. It was about a broken violin from a thrift store that taught a lonely boy how to speak without words. He thought about all the nights in that cold basement, all the times he wanted to quit, but kept going, all the people who looked at him and saw nothing worth noticing. They could not see his future because they only looked at his surface. But music sees deeper. Music finds the truth hiding beneath the skin, and tonight that truth was shining brighter than any spotlight as he took his final bow. He made a silent promise. He would never forget where he came from. He would use his gift to inspire other kids who felt invisible. He would prove that talent has no price tag and dreams have no expiration date. The poor boy with the broken violin had become something more, not because the world finally saw him, but because he finally saw himself. And sometimes that is all it takes to change everything.